And by I'm going to begin by saying that this event will be recorded and then will be put on the Institute of African Studies website. So you should be aware of that, just in terms of your own levels of comfort about asking questions and so on. People have different concerns. Okay, so welcome to the 2023 series of the Knowing Africa seminar, run as a collaboration between the Canada 150 Research Chair, which is me, basically, and the Institute of African Studies, where I live. We are based at Carleton University in Ottawa. We are based on the unceded land of the native peoples of Turtle Island. And I think that we are very aware of the way in which we, living in settler colonial societies in different parts of the world, have similar kinds of preoccupations, questions, in the largest sense, about the ways in which power works and doesn't work, the ways in which knowledge is constituted, and whose knowledge is considered to be important. And in this seminar series, we're really trying to overturn some of those taken for granted hierarchies. So, in doing that, we're grateful to and try to honor modes of debate and modes of communication that come out of Indigenous forms of sociability and Indigenous forms of debate. And we try to hopefully do justice to that. It's a really wonderful thing to open the seminar series for 2023 with a book by a much admired former colleague, but still friend, from Wits University, Hugo Canham. Hugo's book, Riotous Deathscapes, which is this book, published by Duke University Press just this year, right, Hugo? Just 2023. I have been telling everybody that I fizz. My body fizzes with excitement whenever I read it, and I find myself going back and forth. And I hope you'll get a sense of why that is in the conversation. But I'm going to introduce, before we talk about the book, the two people who are at the heart of the conversation. Hugo Canham, who is a professor at the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at the University of South Africa. He is based in Johannesburg. He was before that a professor of psychology at Wits University, and you can Google Hugo's WordPress site, in which he talks about moving out of a sort of conventional academic mode, academic discipline, into a different kind of academic and writer space. Hugo's a writer, a transdisciplinary scholar, truly transdisciplinary, actually, as you will gather from reading the book, working at the intersection between Black studies, African feminism, and African queer studies, and working in a really ambitious way to ask questions about what is it like to live in racial capitalism? How do we understand the conditions of Blackness? What kinds of archives do we draw on for the ways in which we position our thinking, what we consider to be theory making, who we consider to be the theory makers, and how do we have a mode of thinking and a mode of writing that is not simply based on the knowingness of being human, but is an interaction with the natural world, with history, with territory, with oceans, with the land, with a range of different ways of thinking about the human condition in a relational sense. And Hugo will tell us more about that. In conversation with Hugo in the book, as well as in conversation today, we're delighted to have Professor Rinaldo Walcott, a Canadian writer and a Canadian thinker at the top of his game, I would say. Now working with Rinaldo Walcott, used to be at the University of Toronto, but is now the Carl V. Granger Professor and Chair of Africana and American Studies at the University at Buffalo, so just over the border. Like Hugo, Rinaldo's work crosses disciplines. His work addresses questions of Black diasporic studies and cultural studies, in gender, in sexuality and education. And I think what is really remarkable about both of these scholars is the way in which they model for us ways of thinking and writing that go well beyond the conventional modes of social sciences and you know, what it is we are taught constitutes good research. And by doing that, open up our minds to understanding differently. So Rinaldo has himself written a number of very influential books. He is the author of The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Freedom, which is also at Duke University Press. His book on property, policing, prisons, and the call for abolition was a Globe and Mail Book of the Year, also a CBC, on the CBC list of best Canadian nonfiction books, and has been nominated by for several book awards. So what we're going to do is give Hugo an opportunity to talk to us about the book in any way that he would like to do that, to tell us about why he wrote it, what its major themes are, and what it illuminates for us. I will then hand over to Rinaldo to respond to the book, and then we will open it up for a general conversation, as we always do. You can put your questions in the Q&A, but I would also like to encourage you to put your hand up and turn on your camera and speak to us, because that's a somewhat more humanizing way of engaging on the Zoom. So welcome, everybody. Welcome people in Canada, people in Africa, and people in other parts of the world. US, Denmark, am I right? Senior Alfred, are you in Denmark? It's just wonderful to have such a lovely group of people in this discussion. So, Hugo, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about your book.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for the warm welcome. And thank you to everyone for attending. Pleased to see people from across different time zones. I'm imagining that those that are on the African continent will be having dinner at the same time as we engage in this discussion. So when Shireen and I worked at the same university, she facilitated an important opening for me to start working on this book. So thank you once again, Shireen, for that, and for today. I came across Rinaldo Walcott's work on Twitter initially under the handle Black Diaspora Faggotry. I also learned a lot from the sociality of his rum and cocktails on Twitter. I then began to read his work. During one of my iterative revisions of Riotous Deathscapes on a hot February in 2021 at the height of the pandemic year, in Southern Africa, while I was holed up in an apartment in Mozambique, I was reading his work, and perhaps moved by the wine or Doge M, I wrote an email to him to thank him for his work. He may not remember this. I share this account to express my really unbridled delight and appreciation that is in conversation with this book today. I will make 3 points about Riotous Deathscapes in my opening remarks to this webinar. Rinaldo, you'll forgive me, but the first one relates to form, and I follow you by reading a Twitter quote on form. So, and this is to quote, "Form and Black studies, a few things. A radical Black studies has always considered form as both problem and freedom. Form and its considerations is why Du Bois wrote novels, essays, etc., and not just disciplinary type books. Form and discipline is a central problematic of Black studies. Disciplines have always been a central critique in Black studies for what they cannot produce about the fullness of Black life, but also how disciplines are fundamentally implicated in the production of Black life as non-life. For more than 2 decades, cultural studies has called for a radical subversion of academic form. Rarely have scholars heeded this call. Saadia Hartman's Wayward Lives and Christina Sharp before her, in the wake, has enacted the cultural studies call for new forms in academic work, most forcefully in contemporary studies. We do not all have to write like them. I simply can't. But we can be conscious about our form. We can do battle with it. We can recognize and be clear about the ways in which our form obscures and reveals simultaneously. So I'll stop the quote there. Now, I know that Riotous Deathscapes fails in places, but this tweet strengthened my resolve to resist disciplinarity and to aspire to deformation. The place and people about whom I wrote are best written in the deformative practice of Black studies. My disciplinary training was in psychology, but I have long known that the discipline has pathologized my village and its people about whom this text is about. To write them ethically without consigning my brother, for instance, to the waste heap of Black pathology demanded that I use a range of ways of seeing. I deliberately turned my back on the discipline and disciplinarity. This was central for conceiving of what I call ukwakumkhanya, which is a way of attending askance through multiple takes and vantage points. Ultimately, then, I wanted to give my protagonist the gravity of theoretical beings, this, to quote what Saadia Hartman says to describe the people that she writes about. So theoretical beings who think deeply and theorize their condition and lives. The book is therefore an illustration of how those cast as minor subjects insist themselves into being, not to claim greatness or lost glory, but in ways that stake a claim to the land and to the world. It is also an intervention in Black studies to say that we on the continent are also theorists of our lives and condition, and we exist in many ways as more than sites of data or extraction. Amapondo are not a closed society, and porosity with neighboring AmaZulu to the north, AmaXhosa to the south, the San, the Khoikhoi, and white, Asian, and African castaways that unintentionally crashed onto the tempestuous shoreline constitute our being. So this idea of relation as central to world making, even in the smallest spaces. So chapter 1 of the book addresses this by conceiving of relation as part of boundless forms of Blackness. In Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, we are told that as the boat wends its way up the Congo River, those on the boat observe the silhouettes of Africans howling and leaping, spinning and making horrid faces. Years later, Chinua Achebe would come to realize that he was not one of those on the boat, steaming up the Congo in the heart of darkness. Rather, and to quote him, I was one of those unattractive beings jumping up and down on the riverbank, making horrid faces. And I close the quote. When we consider 17th and 18th century shipwrecks on the crashing Mbondo shoreline, how can this perspective of white superintendents be reconfigured? Not as sealed vessels of enlightenment passing through the wild coast, but as undone, adrift, and compelled to be in relation in a world-making moment of reckoning. The British media reported the crashing of the SS Grosvenor in the tradition of the Heart of Darkness. But if we take the perspective of the Mbondo people who watch the wreck, something else emerges. The strangers are disheveled and bewildered in the black shoals of Lambase, and the Mbondo are secure on their land. This chapter sits with this emergence from the ocean. In it, I am at once watchful on the shoreline with my ancestors, but I am also tied to the disoriented, wrecked survivor who stumbles on the rocky shoals of Omambundweni. The second theme is how the book deals with death. There's a lot of death in the book. If we return to the excerpt that I read by Rinaldo Walcott, I may be guilty of producing Black life as non-life, but I deal with this tension throughout the book, from the title, the cover artwork, the stories told, the scholars whose work I engage, and the theorization that I seek to assemble. The title places riot and death together. Death may appear passive, but I wanted to gesture to its aliveness. Sure, there is mass death going on here, but we are also creatively using death to live full lives. The landscape and the practice of death is unruly. It does not surrender to annihilation by racial capital, state abandonment, ongoing state abandonment. And in Rinaldo's words, it is uninterdictable. The cover art is a riot of death and transgression. Dumile Feni, a South African artist, made it in 1965, shortly before he went into exile in 1968. He died of a massive heart attack in New York in 1990, just as apartheid was ending, and he was due to return home. In addition to the double register of deadly riot, by placing his artwork on the cover, I wanted to claim Feni as an ancestor. The place of ancestors is one of veneration, where Blackness defeats death and is a way we fashion death into our very cosmologies, our being. Consequently, while we mourn the pervasive nature of Black death in our families, communities, and in the Black diaspora and throughout the world, we create an unshakable bond with the dead. We theorize with death. We inhabit it. The third and last theme we're touching on in this brief introduction is the centrality of the natural world as fundamental to my theorization of what I termed in the book Mbondo theory: rivers, the ocean, hills, the rock face, and graves. As my colleague Grace A. Musila pointed out, these sites function differently to their location in hegemonic environmental humanities scholarship and climate change debates. I did not want to be part of a scholarship that places Black people in antagonistic relation to the natural world. In Mambondweni and across the continent, I see how people fashion their very personhood from ancestral rivers that ground them in place and connect and bind them in boundless Black sociality that embraces animals and the land. As I point out in the introduction to the text, the word Mbondo is the name of the people that reside in this place, also known as the Wild Coast of South Africa, but also it is the name of the horns of animals. To suture, this suture of the animal landscape and personhood refuses colonial environmentalism that places people in competition with animals, both on Winter's chain of being and in how Africans are moved off ancestral land to make way for large nature reserves so that tourists can come on safari. So instead of pushing against scripts that animalize Black people, I tend to lean into the potentialities of this animalization. So the book also engages in a conversation with Indigenous studies, African studies, queer studies, and a range of other themes that I won't in this kind of opening gambit go into. But I imagine that some of these may emerge in the conversation later on. Thank you once again, Shireen, and thank you, Rinaldo, and thank you to my colleagues whose names I'm seeing on the screen. Thank you for coming. Thanks.
Thanks, Hugo. There's a lot more to be said about the ways in which you take this forward, and so we'll return to that. But let me hand over to Rinaldo now.
Thank you, Professor Hassim and the African Institute, for inviting me into this really important conversation about a really outstanding and important book. I'm coming to you today from Six Nations territory, which many people know as Buffalo, New York. Riotous Deathscapes is a complex and complicated work. It's an intellectually generous work. It's beautifully crafted and presented, and the conversations it will engender, and I'm sure has already engendered, are going to be wide and deep and take many different kinds of forms. One of the forms that I want to bring to the conversation today is the specificity of place that Riotous Deathscapes occupies, and how that specificity of place returns us to a kind of universality from below. Of course, we all know the word universality is tainted as to be almost unusable. But this is the thing Canham turns us to. Subjugated and discredited knowledges. These knowledges that might actually save us. What we might only be able to call the universality of the subaltern. Placeness then is central to this work, and this work undoes and redoes placeness. And in doing so, this work leads us directly into diaspora, and simultaneously it has the diaspora rejoin the continent in ways too profound for me to enumerate this afternoon from my time zone. But one place to begin that work is through Black studies, its inheritances and its future. And this work most profoundly marks the future of Black studies. I was very pleased for Hugo to add in to your commentary today on your book that Africa is not simply a place of extraction. Your book is a profound refutation of that practice and that sensibility. So this book is the future. This work is the future of Black studies. It is errant scholarship to rift off of Glissant. It refuses discipline, not because to refuse discipline is easy, but because discipline simply cannot tell the story of Black life in the profound way that you have given it to us in the pages of Riotous Deathscapes. One of the ways in which I think your work, Hugo, marks the future of Black studies is its conjoining of Black studies and Indigenous studies, which provides a profound reorientation of knowledge within the context of Black studies and within the context of Indigenous studies. And I think this book has so much to teach those of us in North America about how and where and what kinds of new solidarities might be built out of thinking Blackness as Indigenous too, and thinking about the many maneuvers of what we might call global indigeneity. Your work opens up new terrains for us to think about the logics of the settler and for us to think about settler colonialism. But your work also reminds us that Indigenous peoples are on the move, moving around the globe, even as the specificity of their place or their placeness continues to inform their encounters with others. And for me, reading your work and thinking about some of the conversations and debates in the North American context around Black and Indigenous solidarities, the question of cosmogony, again, as you hinted at in your opening comments, becomes centrally important. The question of spirituality, the question of the relationship between social beings to be called humans, land, animals, and the environment that an alienated postmodern human needs to reintegrate into remains a central and beautifully articulated in your work. It made me think of the work that Jackie Alexander has been doing around some of these questions, as she brings these concerns around spirituality, land, a different kind of cosmogony into a confrontation with late modern or postmodern human life. Your work, through Sylvia Winter and others, now begins to set some new terrains for how we might begin to think about new social forms of life. But there's another side to your work in Black studies that I think too is important for thinking about the rejoining of Africa and its diaspora. And that is the generous and exhaustive and beautifully engaged manner in which your work takes up the intellectuals and the intellectual apparatus of Africa and its diaspora for thinking and for thought. You rejoin those of us dispersed in the Americas and elsewhere through some beautiful, rigorous thinking and engagement with our own writing, our own confrontations, our own sense of what it means to live a kind of, what I call in my own word, a kind of deadly living. And by deadly living, we don't mean being living dead, which is kind of zombie-ish. But what we mean is the way in which Black living and Black life is always in some ways caught up in death or caught up with death. But that death too is also a form of movement, a form of migration, if you will, a form of transition. So Hugo, you would know these moments that I mentioned because of the profound way in which you work with Black diaspora thinkers, but here I invoke questions of hauntology, questions of the wake, and questions of catastrophe, all of which your work limns and expands and deepens for us through a very particular concentration on place. Some people might think at the first encounter that the specificity of place in this work is a turn to the anthropological, or that they can turn away from the specificity of place in this work. But it's by embedding this work so profoundly in the specificity of place that you are able to open up for us the manner in which this deadly living of Black life also reorients what it means to live a life. I could go on and on about what I think is beautiful about this work, but I will make one final point about it. And it's a point that I think so many of us, both on the continent and in diaspora, are grappling with right now. And it's the question of queerness and queer method and the queer scaffolding of this beautiful work that you have offered us. It's at the site of queer that the problem of the human most profoundly comes to rest. And it's at the site of queer that questions of bodily sovereignty and of freedom come to bear most profoundly on why it is that the traditional disciplines are incapable of being able to tell the story of what Black life might mean and is anywhere on this earth. Thank you for a profound work, Hugo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Walcott. I was very struck, as you were, Rinaldo, but with the way in which this the method of this book, this way of assembling the ancestors, the people with whom you think. The ways in which you not only assemble the human ancestors, but the ways in which the water, the rivers, the ocean, the rivers, the land becomes a character in the story. And Hugo, that idea of relationality that is at the heart of this book strikes me as one that is so open and so generous in the way in which it enables us to think about the human condition. And it's a relationality that goes so much beyond the kind of empty, to my mind, the empty conceptualizations that we see with Ubuntu, for example. Here, this is a relationality that understands that there were moments there are unequal forms of power, but at the same time that we encounter each other as human, and that the way in which we encounter the land and the water that we live in and that make possible life, that these make us think of ourselves against a canvas that's both much grander and also much more intimate, and in doing that, this way of seeing queerly, of looking askance, as you put it, requires that you a different perspective. It is the perspective that enables you to see further, as you say, but it also, to see queerly is also to see differently all kinds of encounters between humans and between humans and the natural world. So I think because a lot of people will not have read the book yet, I just wanted to point that out, and I wanted to point out to you the way in which, to all of us here, the way in which that kind of looking askance, of looking queerly, that Rinaldo also picked up on and described, is it changes so much about the ways in which South African history in particular is understood, the detail of South African history. And for me, this is, you speak back to history, you speak back to anthropology, you speak, actually, I think, I know you want to escape the disciplinarity of psychology, but it feels to me like you bring in the psychic and affective structure of being human in the most deep and interesting ways in this book. And so we think differently about Nontlawuse. We think differently, or we see through your eyes a different way of thinking about what these shipwrecks, these shipwrecked people, how they may have encountered each other, that is so beyond the kind of literature of fear and hatred and othering, that actually enables you to think even about these white shipwrecked people as not only a fearful other, but you put yourself, your ability to put yourself in that place of looking at that encounter and saying, how might they have related, is something that's so beyond the conventional historical writing. And I think it is, for that reason, very illuminating. So I'm going to just, and this is, I'm just adding to the vast number of ways in which we will all read this book in many, many ways. We are that, you talk about in this book about having two publics, and we're at least one public for your book, I think, the public that you want to think with and together with whom you want to think and want to encourage us to think differently too. So I wondered if you wanted to respond at all at this point, or do you want us to open up to questions and answers? And I want to encourage people to think about questions you may want to ask. Sorry, one last thing I want to say. I loved, you know this already, because I think I've email. I love this book. I love this book. So the way in which you talk about rituals and rituals of body, I just, the idea of rituals as pause and of the cleansing ritual, to me as an outsider to those to particular cultural forms you discuss here, I think did more than any anthropological text, I just want to say, to explain how it is that we can live in a place like South Africa, which is a deathscape, how we can live in it. How do we live in death in this way? All right, Hugo, do you want to?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rinaldo, for those words. I mean, they will carry me for a long time. And for the, I think, the lexicon that you've advanced in giving kind of new framing to the work, that I appreciate. The concept of deadly living, right? The deathscapes that Shireen, you referred to, that we live in them, with them, we fashion life, and in powerful ways that don't undo the dying, but like are on the move and creative, and that's powerful. And I think also coming from, writing about a community, coming from a community that throughout history has lived total neglect. Before, in the colonial moment, in the apartheid moment, in the present moment, that people nevertheless live full lives with the deadliness that is so inherent to the landscape. And I think possibly to just borrow Tiffany Letabo King's phrase of kind of black shoals, this idea to me that is almost also an offering, this emergence of something in the ocean, weather, or in that indeterminate space between land and ocean and water, that proffers a space for relation. And in this crashing that I'm describing with shipwrecks, that the people offer a landing space for strangers, and strangers, the rivals took it or left it at their cost. Well, they had choice in doing this. The point I'm making is that in the present, these little openings are always there. Openings for relation, of being different kinds of humans in a world that is invested in death, in killing. So, and through the small example, highlighting, offering a way in which we think about relation, about openings that are always present and that are often shunned and not taken. Yeah, and what happens when we take the opening?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, would anyone like to step into this conversation with an observation or a question or curiosity? Hanashe, nice to see you. If you want to turn on your camera, that would be great. Hello.
Hi, Shireen. How are you?
Good. So nice to see you.
Thank you. And just to say, oh, can you hear me well? This is internet is not so great. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Panashe.
This internet.
Let us tell her we can hear her. She can't hear us. Oh. She seems to have dropped. Would anyone else
Yeah, I was wondering if Hugo might want to say something to us about the landscape of this text. One of course, there's the rivers and so on, but there's the hill. And there's also the mud. And the poignant story that you tell of your mom in the mud. And I wonder if you wanted to reflect on that as a part of thinking about the kind of cosmogony of Black life that you craft in this text. But you don't have to either. Panashe is back.
Panashe is back. Well, do you want to answer that, Hugo? Do you want to respond, or do you want to take a few comments?
I can take a few and then come back. Thank you.
Okay, Panashe is back, and we have Malusi Nkomo. Welcome, Malusi. His hand is also up, and Kati is from Carlton's also wants to ask a question. Okay, Panashe.
Well, just firstly, just to say thank you to you, Hugo. This is really such a wonderful text. I've had the pleasure of working through it as I've done some of my own theorizations, and particularly the work that you do, thinking about that history that's overdetermined within South African literature, the Grosvenor as a particular kind of a particular kind of specter around what happens within white settlerdom and not thinking about the other side of the kind of ethics, and particularly around Ubuntu. So for me, working on that and thinking of that history from our own epistemologies has been quite important. And there's two at least related things that were quite interesting for me. Firstly, not directly related within the text, but just thinking, and perhaps Rinaldo, you can also come in here, but there's something that I often always want to bring up here is the way in which within Black studies, there's a lot of thinking about Black South Africa and not thinking with Black South Africa. So it's a site to theorize about. And very often it comes up throughout many scholars' work. And the kind of generous readings which we do, Black thinkers across the Black world, I find that it's not really reciprocated within the scholarship, even though if you look at the acknowledgements, very often you find that these are interlocutors, but somehow that way of thinking with Black South Africans as a site of thought, they're theorizing their own conditions, whether it's racial capitalism, for example. You wouldn't think that Black South Africa has ever thought about that, for example, or you're thinking about Afro-pessimism and the fact that, you know, a large part of that theorization comes from Frank B. Wilderson being in South Africa, but the thought of Black South Africans never figures in that. So I wonder what you're thinking about that is, particularly as a book that's very much positioning itself as theory, and if that kind of reciprocation will happen with those with whom you are doing the work of interlocuting, because I find that us as Black South Africans are very good with thinking with the rest of the Black world, but that is not reflected in the kind of citational practices that we have with our peers. The second part of it, what I absolutely love and what is missed when we don't think with Black South Africans is the fact that you are thinking through with our own epistemologies. You're very deliberate about talking about Mpondo theory, very deliberate about using our own ways of thinking and being within things that we typically think of as African traditional culture, which does not exist because that sort of is time-bound and it doesn't allow for that capacity for thinking through the crisis of settler colonial modernity. So I'm just really interested in what that meant for you as a practice to be very deliberate about thinking through those indigenous epistemologies and the questions of settler colonial modernity.
Thanks, Panashe. Great comments. We have Malusi, Kati, Yvette, and Bibi Bakari Yusuf. You had your hand up and I can't see it now. How do you want to do this? You want to respond now to this? Yeah.
Okay, sure. I was going to say 3, but I can.
Oh, 3. Okay, we'll take 3. We'll do Malusi next then. Malusi, go ahead. Malusi, I think it's your chance to talk. We can't hear you. Can you hear us? Okay, so I don't know what's wrong with the sound on your side.
And he's in the US, I might add, Shireen, so it's not load shedding factor of the third world.
He'll come back, maybe like Panashe. Oh, Panashe, are you in the first world, US, I'm sure, also with the...
Let me say, my internet is just as bad when I'm in Boston, if not worse. So please don't
much for that. Kati.
Yes, thank you. I just, I haven't read the book and I look forward to doing so. So forgive this question. I wondered, Hugo, whether you could, what your response was to Shireen's talking about you're using some of your psychology background to really bring up the effective nature of life, of living with Black Death, and I particularly was, for me, I asked because one of the major insights from psychology for me is just how fraught and ambivalent relations are, that there can be both aggression and love simultaneously, for example, or how fraught attachment can be. And I just wondered what your, whether you felt there were things that you could bring from psychology as you were thinking about this from a transdisciplinary perspective.
Thanks, Kati. Hello, Yvette, and welcome. Yvette, can you hear us?
Thank you, Shireen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Twice in
can.
a month, say we were hanging out more lately. It's great fun. Hello, everybody. Hugo, thank you for writing such an insightful book. I too have not yet managed to get a copy. As you know, they were sold out at Open Books. And I just haven't had a chance now to go to town and look at clocks, but it's really driving me crazy, and it's top of my priority list before the your first print is sold out. But so a question without having read the book, and stretching your interdisciplinarity to the limit, I think, because of course, as you know, my background is climate change. And which is turning up some very interesting results around resilience, the concept of how we come back from big disasters and so on. And one of the things that seems to be one finding that seems to be fairly consistent is that, for instance, rates of PTSD are lower in countries of the global south, despite very important structural and material reasons why people should be, both systemically and individually vulnerable to trauma. And despite the fact that the West has so much more mental health care, other findings showing that rates of depression also seem to be lower in the global south, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But I was just wanting to ask you how indigenous knowledge systems worked for you as a reading and writing subject. I mean, one thing that I think a lot about is what it means to be a cultural worker these days, and what we put ourselves through. And so how was the interaction between you and I want to say Mpondomise culture?
Thanks, Yvette. And we have Asanda and Gopika still hands up, but I'll let Hugo take a go at this, because otherwise it becomes overwhelming for you, I think.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for those really great questions that I won't address very well, but nevertheless will attempt to. So yes, the hill, mud. I talk quite a great deal, or I write quite a great deal about the hill, because it kind of inserts itself in political moments. So the Mbondo revolt, which happened through the 50s, and the high note in the 1960s, a lot of that strategizing against the police, against the apartheid government, was occurring on a range of hillsides, because of course the terrain is very choppy and hilly, but the hill becomes the place for strategizing, for fortification, for ritual, to protect, to think with ancestors. There's something about its proximity, I don't know, it gives clarity, proximity, whether it's to the sky. And then in 2012, and I saw Dan Magazine was here earlier, and because I say that because he writes quite a bit about Marikana, where 34 of the people killed were from the location that I'm writing about on that day. And that was the vast majority of people. And they had engaged in similar ritual and rites on the hills to protect themselves against police fire. Of course, we see the outcome was not the desirable one, because they were shot in their backs and they died. Melusi also writes about Americana, by the way. So the place of the hill is seminal in these high moments, but also in the daily life of people, whether it's going to ask for rain during drought, and of course as a terrain that one must walk through because roads are terrible, right? When it rains, it's impassable, you know, and it's, so while it's really beautiful, simultaneously it's also really difficult to live in the space, and healthcare crises can be deadly for that reason. So the terrain is central to the kind of local cosmology and meaning making. To talk to a neighbor, there used to be in South Africa an advert by the telecommunications company shot in that place with neighbors shouting across the hill at each other in greeting, because that's the kind of local sociality that emerges because of the terrain. So the Pinashe, thank you very much and great to see you. I want to say less about how the rest of the world engages us, because I insist on generosity, right? I think if we're talking about Black studies and Black life wills, generosity is an important attribute of being, right? Relation. And part of the practice is, at least that I'm trying to enact with its limitations, is that also because it's so enriching to imagine a world that operates beyond the borders, as well as the deracination and the cross-Atlantic slave trade, to imagine that those boundaries that are meant to create violence can actually be overcome in a spirit of Black study, Black relation, is for me quite a profound thing. And I have learned so much, and I continue to learn so much from peers elsewhere in the world. Now, how they read African work and how African work circulates is another thing. Also because the places because there's a lot of work happening, but the places that much of the work is being published, right, does not travel globally. And maybe I shouldn't even start on that conversation, and what the geopolitics are about how work circulates. So and then I think there was the question on resilience and psychological disorders. Thank you, Yvette. By the way, Yvette, Dr. Abrahams, I engage with your work quite a bit in this book. You may or may not approve of the ways that I do that. But just to say, I learned a great deal from you. I think how we use, the diagnostic manuals purport to be global, that the psyche can be universalized and standardized across place. So PTSD, as it emerges in a particular location where the American Psychological Association resides, can then be applied in uniform ways across the world without regard to the other ways of knowing that coexist and predate it, means that many of the ways that we experience psychological pathology or don't, or weather it, are invisible to the kind of universal mechanisms that measure these. So your comment about lower rates of psychological disorders, etc. I don't know those stats, but what I can say is that there are multiple ways of healing, of being, and of weathering, right? If there's one thing that the African continent does is weather unhumaning, has done for centuries, right? Extraction, endless extraction. And we're still here, and we're a growing population that has more young people than older people. And there's something to be said about what I won't term resilience, but about the skills we've adopted to weather, right? And to survive and to live. Yeah, I think I may have missed other things, but I'll pause there.
Thank you. Malusi, do you want to have one more go? Then I'll hand it to Asanda and Gosheng. No.
Can I say something to Panashay's question?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I want to acknowledge, that tricky and sticky and uncomfortable moment, or what appears as a lack of reciprocal relation. I think it's important. I don't think that it was always like that. But I think that there's a way in which certain kinds of institutional demands frame who we imagine we're in conversation with. And so while my African colleagues on the continent might be more generous and capacious in their own citation and engagement practices, that the rigors of the North Atlantic Academy might not be as reciprocal in the same way. And so again, I think some of this has to do with how we all get caught up in the racial capital that is the university. And so we've got to think through what a kind of politics of relationality is, continent, diaspora, and so on. But I think the kind of larger question is also one that sits at the kind of core of what might be a particular, and again, Hugo works so well with various aspects of queer theory, turning to Sarah Ahmed's work on orientation. What kinds of orientations might we be attuned to in Black studies? For instance, we are here gathered under the auspices of the Institute of Africa. And in many of our institutional homes, what's called African studies doesn't get to speak to Black studies. Not only are they apart intellectually, but they're often apart even physically in different buildings and so on. And so this is part of the work that I think the kind of future of the intellectual engagement that Riotous Deathscapes is plotting for us. This book immediately pinpoints, to put it in the clearest terms I can think of right now, the ridiculousness of the kinds of intellectual and scholarly separations that, since the 1960s and into the present, we have been working with.
Thanks, Rinaldo. Yeah, good point. Asanda? Gopika, I think, may have left, but Asanda, go ahead. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for this session. I'm really sorry to have missed two conversations in Cape Town, but I'm glad to be here coming in via the internet. So, I mean, I think I haven't read the book, of course, but I'm very excited about this work and kind of its potential for engaging. Particularly, I think, I mean, of course, it's about Amabondo, but I also come from the Eastern Cape, the closer side of the Eastern Cape, the other side, the Ciskei, as it were, the former Ciskei, as it were. And I remember growing up, so many conversations being had about underground cities, so many conversations being had about, Black people's relationships with the water, Black people's relationship, a spiritual relationship with the water. And I think what really excites me about this work is the attempt to kind of engage at a historical level with that history. Because I think, often and I know even as somebody who kind of spends a lot of time looking at history, I'm always amazed and fascinated by how, like, literally every day I'm discovering new things about this history of ours. And I'm discovering new angles and ways in which we were dispossessed and everything in between that I hadn't thought about before. And so I love the idea of kind of a multidisciplinary engagement that seeks to center, the people who were found on the land by the strangers who arrived from the sea. So I'm looking forward to reading the book, and I really appreciate just the snippet of just a snippet of kind of what the book could be about. So I don't have a question. I just have an appreciation. Yeah, thanks.
Appreciation is good and important. Thank you so much. I'm going to read Malusi's comment because he is something wrong with the technology, unfortunately. So Malusi says, Hugo, I'm following on your original comment, the meeting of land and water, the shipwrecked stranger and people on the shore, and the resulting contestations, traumas, deaths, and so on. Can we extend this line of thought to include encounters between South Africa and other strangers, including those crossing its northern borders? Is it possible to use your theory to discuss how people, the new strangers and South Africans, learn to live within these contexts of anti-Black pogroms and xenophobic and other traumas of post-apartheid South Africa? Is it possible to discuss the development of rituals of trauma and deathscapes in, say, urban Johannesburg or Cape Town townships? So there you go, Hugo. I think that is what we have for now. Others will jump in, I'm sure.
Sure. Thank you, Melusi. Yeah. So the nature of racial capitalism is that it can be practiced by the Black state, and we can be put into competition with each other, in ways like what nationalism produces. Because as you're speaking about new arrivals from across the northern border, I'm thinking that I have known, for example, Malawans living in South Africa since the early 80s, when I gained I was a very young kid, but that the idea of stranger is not new, and hospitality has always been negotiated and tricky and sticky, but there's something about this moment and how, as the post-democratic state seeks to create itself, it it has to point out the other and place people into competition with the other. I don't know how this, so while I'm writing about a small place, as Rinaldo suggested, that there are potential universalisms that can be taken from it, and I'm hopeful that there can be some thinking about how we can think about cityscapes in ways that are productive and related to this. Yeah, xenophobia in our local context sucks.
Yeah. Rinaldo, do you have any thoughts you want to add into this conversation at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, what Hugo just said, and in the book itself, that the specificity of placeness really in some ways is a critique of that meta-narrative of nation. And in fact, that meta-narrative of nation can only function as yet another container and exercise of violence. So the question of the cityscape, the question of xenophobia and xenophobic violence in the contemporary nation state of South Africa also has to displace the specificity of the kind of placeness that Hugo has written about. All of that has to be displaced in the making of this kind of meta-narrative of the South African identity. But as we know, by turning to a work like Hugo's, that's made from the pieces and the scraps and the incorporation of all other kinds of cosmogonies and ethnicities into this national identity that then enacts violence on others who are deemed a stranger. And so this kind of question of hospitality, of a radical hospitality, is a turn to a figure like Jacques Derrida, where the question of what is home is not indeed for those who are already there, but it's for the guest who has arrived, for the one who called a stranger to articulate. I think fits very well with the kind of cosmological insight that Hugo's work offers us, Mondo territories. And again, fits well with the way in which Hugo works with North American indigenous thinkers and also their understanding of what's at stake in a context of ongoing colonization, of which I think, to go out on a limb, that even though we talk about, the post-apartheid moment of South Africa and the nation state of South Africa and so on, represents, for me, at least in my way of thinking, another site of ongoing colonization. What this book makes so available to us is the kind of profound question of what constitutes freedom.
That's a wonderful moment to kind of pause this kind of conversation, but I feel like I just want to add one little thing, if I may, before we close, and I want to read a little bit from a section of the book to give you a flavor of Hugo's writing and to encourage you to rush out and buy the book and read the book and engage its insights. And even if one doesn't really agree with it, to be engaged in this conversation that has been, I think it would be so incredibly rewarding for everyone. So this is just, I could have picked anywhere in the book, but this bit, and I've got like pencil markings everywhere and what Post-its everywhere and so on. But this I thought maybe tells you something about the book and its project, and then we'll say thank you and close. But this is Hugo says, If to be human can be likened to the splendor of the colonial ship that is at home in deep water, to be Mpondo is to be so many floating African fishing boats, moving tenuously among the rocks, floating in the riotous spray, multiplying and adrift. I have sought to transcribe a series of accounts that move alongside and at times against the image of universalizing and enunciating man. These stories can be visualized as a riot of African fishing boats, staying close to the shore on familiar terrain, or upended on the sand, challenging universality and practicing refusal. I've honed in, I'm just cutting past some words. I've examined the ocean, river, and hill. Here I've honed in on the spiritual dimensions of Mpondo theory with an account of possession and wielding among adolescents. The chapter shows the possession, that possession of Ukupuka Izizwe, points to alienation and simultaneous attempts to undo this through reaching for freedom in the breach. Within this Fanonian breach, which is also a queer time breach, and we haven't really talked about Hugo's conception of time in this book. Possessed adolescents collapse temporality and enter into communion with the ancestral and erotic realms in epiphenomenal temporality. So this queer zone, I wanted to put that out there because I want you to see that what Hugo does with some familiar stories of initiation rituals, of the smearing of the body, which, you know, of course, for those of us who studied political movements, we know about Mkhonto we Sizwe soldiers also smearing themselves with fat and potions in order to protect them from the bullets of the white apartheid state. And yes, it doesn't work, but what Hugo does is take us into that way of thinking about how it is that we might fortify ourselves. What is available? What are the resources that such acts that appear to be mad, that appear to be futile, nevertheless work so importantly to give us the resources to kind of keep going. And that, you know, is how he begins the book. What is it? Why do we keep going? Why does your mother not leave and move to Johannesburg and have you there to care for her in a direct daily way and to get better medical care? Well, because there's a system of meaning making that exceeds what we might think of as, you know, what is rational, or what is the thing one does in the face of endless dying around one. What is it that fortifies us? So I'm going to end there and say thank you so much to all of you. Thank you, Hugo, for your book. Thank you, Rinaldo, for your wonderful reading of the book. Thank you all for coming. And I hope you will buy this book. Really, we have to keep this writer going. We have to make it possible for him to keep writing. So I'll point to the political economy of the publishing industry and say, please buy the book. People in Africa can get the Wits University Press edition, which will be cheaper. I've put a link into the chat, but you can easily find it. And Hugo, thank you very much and good luck with the rest of your writing.
Thank you very much, Shireen, and thank you so much to you and Rinaldo for, you know, so eloquently answering Malusi, because as you're speaking, I'm like, of course, yes, that's what I'm saying. I actually am not invested in the nation, but yeah, I appreciate the space and the warm way in which you've engaged the book. And Rinaldo, yeah, I'm going to call some friends after this and say it happened. Thank you.
Thank you all, and have a good afternoon, a good evening. And we look forward to seeing you again in October. You'll get notices of the next events, but just to say, the next book we'll be discussing is Sipokazi Magadla's book, Gorillas and Combative Mothers. And she will be in conversation with another. So I feel like I just bring all my friends onto this platform, and I love it. But she will be in conversation with Pumla Gwola. So again, some of you are familiar with. We've had Pumla speak about her own book in the series in the past. So thank you all, and go well. Take care.
Thank you.
I'll leave this on for anyone who wants to hang about and say hello.
Thank you, Hugo. Congratulations. I have to run off, but
Thanks. Bye.
it's a pleasure.
Hope to see you again.
I'm going to email you.
Yeah, great. Great.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning, so I don't really know what the book is about. But I'm just sort of wondering, Hugo, I mean, it's not fair to ask you questions now. I mean, the book is obviously about sort of traditional beliefs and cosmology. No?
Well, you missed the part where he was very careful to say this is not about traditional. It's about ways of well, I'm going to let Hugo answer.
Yeah. But Hugo, as a person who writes about African Christianity, I sort of wondered, how has Christianity woven itself into the ideas about the landscape? And then what do people like Baynard, who have worked on the Pondo historically, think about your viewpoint?
I'm actually going to say, Hugo, and you feel free to answer it, but actually the really amazing thing about the book is that Hugo does actually engage all of these ways of thinking. And then that's part of the generosity, I think, of the book, is that he engages everybody who's ever. So anyone who's written in this area that you have not engaged, I thought maybe.
Is it in Pondo or in Pondomisi or a bit of both? I don't know my translation. Pondo, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yes, and William Baynard's
you'll
work
find
is
it in the book.
productive.
Sorry, so Baynard's work is helpful, and Monica Hunter.
Yes, they have. Yeah, Monica Hunter and them. I've read and engaged the work as well. Thank you.
Sorry, I was late.
Yeah, it's fine, Lens.
I just want to say, Hugo, I so appreciated the mode of your writing, the lyricism of it, the way you took the reader into your very intense conversations with all of these different perspectives and schools and traditions and disciplines in such a generous way. As you said, generosity is one of your higher values, but it's demonstrated all the way through the book. The way you engage with people, the way you converse with them, you bring them into the conversation, you pay tribute. But the actual poetry of the book was just stunning. I cried at the end. I sort of read the last chapter, just absolutely wet. So thank you. It's a brilliant, brilliant piece of work.
Thank you. I love that. Not kind of making you cry, but the
crying is good affect, just humanizes us, right?
Because the poetic method, I think, is in part reflection on the place, because it's actually very poetic. And how do you tell a painful story with the ethics of this lyric, right? So I'm glad that resonated with you.
Okay. I was also curious about how many drafts you may have gone through as a co-writer, because the imagery was so vivid. I was imagining the beaches and the rocks and the crashing sea, the hills and the landscape, that it all kind of infused the intense cerebral cognitive aspect, the theory. It just so beautifully melded, and it just felt like it was a lot of work must have gone into that, beyond the usual academic slog that goes into writing.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Lots of revision.
It's also that light touch but serious engagement with academic literature is something I also I really enjoyed, because there's a deep engagement with what academics have written about various of these events and shipwrecks and encounters and so on. But you have a way of sort of standing above it without making it superficial, making the reading superficial. We kind of get it. Maybe because a lot of us have read so much South African history, but you enable us to engage it. Yeah, you assemble all these people. It's a vast cast of writers that you draw on in this book, and it's never stolid literature review, and I really appreciated that. I'm going to study the form of this book. I don't think I could ever write like it, but.
Can I just ask, because I joined half an hour late, so what is the deathscape part? That death is all around, that there's the trauma of colonialism, or sort of high mortality, and people aren't eating well, or or there's illness. I wasn't quite sure where the death comes in. Excuse my ignorance.
I think we're going to say you have to read the book.
Yep.
It's beyond that. It's not. It's a condition. Living with death is the condition that he's trying to. How do we live with death? All of it. That and much more. Okay, so should we let Hugo go, because it's now nearly nearing bedtime? Maybe not. You're young and probably are going to go out and have a party, but it's late in Johannesburg. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
I appreciate it, and people for hanging on. So good to see you.
I'm sorry to waylay you before you go. Just to say, I really enjoyed reading, and I missed the one where you the occasion where you were presenting at Wiser, but I also really enjoyed the excerpt that you did. So first, this is just I really just want to give you an acknowledgement, because I think we don't do that enough, or wait until you have gone. And then we will say, oh, what wonderful work they have done. But I because quite literally the essay that I was working on is Ubuntu, and particularly as a critical philosophy of race. And I'm sure you've heard about, the idea of Abantu basemzini, for example. So particularly that history, that long history of Abelungu, Amamolo, that was really, really great to give just flesh to a lot of the things that a lot of us have been thinking through. But it means that, again, with citational practice, there are only particular sources that we have to use, which, we will use them, but it's great to actually have somebody who is directly descended from that history to be able to speak to it. So just to say that already it's having an impact on some of the theorizations. When I'm done, I would love to share that with you and what that has actually enabled me to do. But that's why I was excited. And I think part of, just to give you background to the question that I asked, is I think obviously, I was at WITS, and then coming to the US, I found I was a lot more generous before. And because the way in which we're taught is to think with the entire Black world. So there was not this thing of African studies, Black studies. There wasn't that, right? I mean, I was at Affiliate at WIT, so there wasn't that
divide.
That divide at all. And then coming to the US, that was the biggest shock of my life, because all of a sudden I'm realizing that, and it's particularly for Black South Africans, because there's a long history of always, there's a reason why Kwesa is going to say Asimo states more and whatever, because of that long history of reading transatlantically, right? That goes back right until the 19th century. So the point being that I'm very well versed, and I probably have also read that obscure Baldwin text. I've also read, all those different texts, but you find that it doesn't go the same way. And the reason why it became a frustration is because at first it was like, oh, maybe because you don't know. So I would send, if someone were to go through my emails, it's quite embarrassing. There are all these reading lists I would send to people to say, oh, you should read this and this, and 1, 2, 3, and this. And then you realize 5 years later, oh, it's not because you don't know. It's not because you don't know. It's because you're refusing.
So can I just ask, are the Black studies people not wanting to read the African viewpoints?
Look, I think the point that just without relaying into getting into that detail, the point being that, and as you say, and I think Rinaldo made a good point, it's not coming out spontaneously. It also has to do with, the fact that I say that I only did African studies or encountered African studies or the idea of an Africanist once I left the continent, because of that, and because we know that it hasn't always been that case. Once we have the Herskovits takeover of African studies, it becomes an area studies project. It's not a project for global Black or Pan-Africanist liberation. So it is obviously within a particular history. So it's not, I don't want to be ahistorical and over to overemphasize the interpersonal dimensions, when we know that, as Rinaldo said, that there are very serious material geopolitical reasons for the kind of ways in which things circulate. Nonetheless, it became that sort of thing where I thought, oh, well, please read, and I just realized that no. And I realized even when I would look into sort of acknowledgements and say, oh, Gandhi, you guys are friends, but how come, and that's sort of a practice that I continue to sort of see. And so it's just quite an interesting thing. So I'm really glad to have this out, and particularly more along why I mentioned the issue around epistemologies and knowledge systems, is particularly around the insistence that we can only do Black studies as critique of Western Enlightenment, not Black studies as a cosmos, right? And thinking through. So, just as a side note, this is part of the reason why recently I wrote the piece about Tutu and Black and African studies and being able to envision a cosmos beyond critique. It's around that refusal to engage Blackness and Blackness as indigenousness and as a mode of thought, not just a mode of action, and as sites to be theorized upon. So that's why I am very excited for your work. And yeah, just really, really excited. I spent days and days amamolo and going through the text, and I'm really excited for what you've been able to bring to us, so that we're not only reading about those shipwrecks through those Grosvenor journals, we're also reading it through a descendant. So I thought that was really, really fantastic. And also thinking through, even in Zimbabwe, we also have similar history, right? That's all over, which is to say that we have different epistemologies around thinking about difference, and which is why, for example, as you're saying, there's no such thing as African traditional culture, because of the fact that we're always moving with time. And I'm glad that I can now say, look, here's an example, because people always look at me like, what are you talking about when I say things like that? And so it's great to have something like this to be able to show that kind of dynamism, not even dynamism, but the point being that this is what it looks like to theorize from within our own epistemology. So just thank you and appreciation for that.
Generative in and of itself, and not as a response always to somewhere else or something else. That's such a lovely way to end this, Panashe. Thank you very much. That appreciation captures so much of what a lot of us
Is it possible to ask Panashe for the reference for her article about these things, Tutu and whatever?
The Boston Review, right?
Send you a link. Hugo, could I get your email address? May I just...
I can send it to you, Deborah.
Fabulous. Thank you, Shireen. Thank you.
Okay.